No mail-order bride lasted 1 week with the feared mountain man, until the fat woman arrived. High on a frozen ridge, where even wolves kept their distance, he lived alone, scarred, silent, and feared by every soul in town. 6 brides had come. 6 had fled before the 7th sunrise. Then, one stormy night, a heavy stage door opened, and a woman stepped out, broad-shouldered, Bible in hand, eyes shining with quiet fire. She wasn't what anyone expected. She wasn't afraid. When she crossed that cabin threshold, something in the mountain began to change. Bread baking, hymns rising, and a heart long buried beginning to stir. But the past has claws. A deputy's warrant, a hidden secret, and a deed that could steal their only water set the valley on edge. The whole town is whispering. Why did she come? What truth did she carry in that worn satchel? And when the men with rifles return to claim the land, will mercy or vengeance rule that mountain? Because this time, it isn't the mountain man who must prove his strength. It's the woman who refuses to leave. Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind howled through the mountain peaks, driving snow against Owen Boone's cabin like handfuls of thrown salt. Inside, the big man moved with practiced motions, his boots scraping across the plank floor as he added another log to the pot-belly stove. The flame's glow did little to warm the emptiness that seemed to seep from the cabin's very walls. Owen's gaze fell on the broken teacup near the door, its delicate pattern now split by a jagged crack. Sarah Miller, his 5th failed attempt at finding a wife, hadn't even stayed long enough to finish her morning tea. The sight of him coming in from the barn had sent her fleeing down the snow-dusted trail, leaving nothing but that broken cup and the echo of a frightened gasp. He didn't blame her, not really. Standing 6'7" with that old scar running down his cheek, he knew how he looked to city folk. The isolation of mountain life had left its mark on him, turning him as rough as the timber he'd used to build this cabin. Still, the rejection stung like the bitter mountain wind. With a sigh that seemed to come from his boots, Owen crossed to the barn door attached to the cabin's side. The connecting passage was his own design, built so he could tend to his animals without battling snowdrifts. Inside, his mule Jenny greeted him with a soft bray, her long ears perking forward. "At least you ain't running from me," Owen muttered, reaching for the feed bucket. The familiar smell of hay and leather filled his nose as he measured out Jenny's dinner. The mule's warm breath ghosted across his weathered hands as she lipped up the grain, and Owen found himself lingering, grateful for the simple comfort of another living thing's presence. Back in the cabin's main room, a folded paper waited on his rough-hewn table like an unwelcome guest. The preacher's neat handwriting seemed to mock him. No more introductions will be sent. 7 words that might as well have been a prison sentence, condemning Owen to a life of solitude in these mountains. He dropped heavily onto the bench, the wood creaking beneath his weight. The letter's crisp edges caught the lantern light, reminding him of all the other letters that had led nowhere. 5 women had come up this mountain, and 5 had left, each one more quickly than the last. The preacher's patience, it seemed, had finally run dry. The sudden rap of hooves against packed snow drew Owen's attention. Through the shuttered window, he caught the movement of the post rider's lantern, swaying like a lost star in the gathering dusk. Strange timing for mail. Usually Ben made his rounds during daylight hours. Must be something important to bring him up the mountain this late. Owen opened the door, letting in a swirl of snow and the post rider's stamping boots. "Evening, Ben," he said, watching the smaller man brush ice from his coat. "Evening, Owen." Ben pulled an envelope from his satchel. Found this mixed in with tomorrow's mail. Thought you might want it sooner rather than later, weather being what it is." He hesitated, then added, "It's from Kansas City." Owen's fingers felt numb as he took the envelope. More delicate handwriting, but different from the others, stronger somehow, with flourishes that spoke of confidence rather than mere decoration. The return address read, "Emily Penrose, seamstress." "Much obliged," Owen said gruffly, already turning away. Ben took the hint and retreated into the snowy night, leaving Owen alone with the unexpected letter. He should burn it. That would be the sensible thing after all these failures. The stove door was right there, hungry for fuel. But something in the weight of the paper, the steadiness of that handwriting, made him pause. Settling back at the table, Owen broke the seal. The letter was longer than most, written in a hand that never wavered. "Dear Mr. Boone, I write to you with honesty in my heart and faith in God's guidance. I am Emily Penrose, 40 years old and a seamstress by trade. The preacher tells me you seek a wife, and I seek a husband who values strength of character over society's narrow views of beauty. I am sturdy of frame and steady of faith. My hands know work, not just the delicate stitches that earn my living, but the harder labor of tending the sick and keeping a household running through difficult times. I've nursed my mother through her final years and kept my own counsel through loneliness. Some might call me plain. Others have been crueler in their descriptions. But I've learned that true beauty lives in acts of kindness, in the ability to face each day with courage and find joy in honest work. I can cook, tend a garden, and turn any house into a home. More importantly, I know how to listen to the quiet things, the thoughts people are afraid to speak aloud. If you seek a wife who will bring fancy manners and delicate sensibilities to your mountain, then I am not she. But if you seek a partner who will stand beside you through storms both weather and life might bring, then perhaps we have something to discuss. I pray you'll consider my words with the same honesty with which they're offered. Yours sincerely, Emily Penrose." Owen read the letter twice more, his calloused finger tracing the steady lines of text. There was something different here, no flowery promises or romantic notions, just plain truth offered without apology. He could almost hear the strength in her words, like the mountain itself. Solid, enduring, unashamed of its nature. The broken teacup caught his eye again. Sarah had been the last, he'd told himself. No more watching hope die in a woman's eyes when she saw him. No more awkward meals spent in silence. No more watching another stranger flee down his mountain. And yet. Owen pulled his coat from its peg, fishing in the pocket for a pencil stub and a scrap of paper he kept there for marking lumber measurements. The rough table served as his desk as he worked out his response, scratching out words and starting again several times before he was satisfied. "Miss Penrose, your letter speaks true. That's rare enough these days to merit attention. I won't paint pretty pictures. I'm a tall man with a scarred face, and I live alone on a mountain because that's where I find my peace. I've built my cabin strong, I keep my animals well, and I pay my debts. Some call me harsh. Maybe they're right. But I reckon there's room here for a woman who isn't afraid of honest work and quiet evenings. The mountain's beautiful if you've got eyes to see it, and the cabin's warm if you've got the strength to help keep it that way. If you're still interested after reading this, write back. If not, no harm done. Respectfully, Owen Boone." He read it over, knowing it wasn't much. But it was honest, like her letter had been. Maybe that counted for something. The night had deepened while he wrote, and the snow was falling harder now. Owen stood at his window, watching the flakes swirl in the darkness like lost spirits seeking shelter. The letter from Emily Penrose felt heavy in his hand, heavy with possibility, heavy with risk. The stove still beckoned, offering the safe certainty of ash and ending hopes. Instead, Owen slipped the letter into his coat pocket, feeling it settle next to his heart. Tomorrow, he'd ride down to town and mail his response. But tonight, he had something he hadn't held in a long while. A small, sturdy flame of hope, flickering like his lantern against the vast dark of the mountain night. For the first time in months, the cabin's silence felt less like loneliness and more like the pause between words in an unfinished conversation. Outside, the wind continued its ancient song against the windows, but inside, Owen Boone sat at his table and read Emily's letter one more time, letting her strong, steady words fill the empty spaces of his mountain home. The stagecoach lurched over another rut, sending Emily Penrose's worn carpetbag sliding across the wooden floor. She caught it with her boot, drawing it closer as the wheels ground against loose shale. 7 days of travel had left her bones aching, but her spirit remained steady as a compass pointing true north. "Ain't many folks head up to Widow's Hill this time of year," the driver called back through the window. His voice carried a note of concern that Emily had heard too many times on her journey. "Especially not ladies." Emily adjusted her woolen shawl, watching snow-laden pines blur past the window. "The Lord guides our paths," she said quietly, more to herself than the driver. Her gloved fingers found the folded letter in her pocket, Owen Boone's rough handwriting matching the rugged landscape they traversed. The coach rounded a bend, revealing Silverton nestled in the valley below, like a handful of matchboxes scattered on white velvet. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray ribbons, and the late afternoon sun caught the church steeple, making it shine like a needle of gold. "Last stop coming up," the driver announced. "You sure about this, ma'am? Boone's place is another mile up that trail, and darkness comes quick in these mountains." Emily gathered her belongings as the coach slowed. "I'm sure it's sunrise, Mr. Jenkins." The stagecoach creaked to a halt outside Silverton's general store. Emily's boots hit packed snow, and the cold mountain air bit at her cheeks. Around her, townsfolk paused in their evening errands, watching with poorly concealed curiosity as she straightened her skirts. Inside the store, the proprietor's eyebrows rose as Emily listed her needs. "Lamp oil, matches, coffee, sugar, and salt pork," she said, counting out coins on the counter. "And a length of good sturdy rope, if you please." "Heading up to Boone's place, are you?" The shopkeeper exchanged knowing looks with two women examining bolts of calico. Their whispers followed Emily like autumn leaves skittering across wood floors. "That's right." Emily met their stares with calm dignity. "I'm expected." A snicker rose from near the pickle barrel. "Expected to turn tail and run, maybe, just like all the others." Emily turned, facing the speaker, a rail-thin man with tobacco-stained teeth. "The Lord's timing is perfect," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And his children shouldn't mock what they don't understand." The man's smile faded. Something in Emily's steady gaze made him look away first. The shopkeeper wrapped her purchases in brown paper, his movements deliberate. "Miss, there's talk of snow tonight. Heavy snow. Maybe you'd best wait till morning." "Thank you for your concern," Emily said, tucking the packages into her carpetbag. "But I've waited long enough." Outside, Mr. Jenkins was adjusting his team's harness, shooting. Worried glances at the darkening sky. "Road gets treacherous past the switchbacks, ma'am. Ice like glass up there. Wouldn't feel right, taking you further today." Emily settled her purchases and squared her shoulders. "Then I'll walk the rest, Mr. Jenkins. Much obliged for bringing me this far." "Walk?" He gaped at her. "Ma'am, you can't." "I most certainly can." Emily smiled, patting his arm. "The good book says our steps are ordered by the Lord. I reckon that includes steep paths. She set off before anyone else could protest, her sturdy boots crunching in the snow. Behind her she heard more whispers, more predictions of failure. But Emily had long since learned to let such things roll off her like water from a duck's back. The trail switched back and forth up the mountainside, each turn revealing new views of the valley below. As the light faded, the wind picked up, carrying ice crystals that stung Emily's face. She paused occasionally to catch her breath, using these moments to pray, not for deliverance from the challenge, but for strength to meet it. The last rays of sun painted the clouds in shades of amber and rose when Emily finally spotted smoke rising above the trees. Her legs trembled with fatigue, but her heart lifted at the sight. A few more steps brought Owen Boone's cabin into view. Solid logs and a steep roof, with lamplight glowing behind shuttered windows. Emily stopped to straighten her hair and brush snow from her skirts. "Lord," she whispered, "whatever comes next is in your hands." She had barely reached the door when it swung open, spilling golden light onto the snow. Owen Boone filled the doorway like a bear in its cave mouth. His beard was indeed frosted with ice, and the scar on his face looked deeper in the shadows. But it was his eyes that caught Emily's attention. Dark with wariness, and something that might have been hope, quickly shuttered. "You're wasting your time," he growled, though he made no move to close the door. Emily looked up at him, taking in all 6 feet and 7 inches of his imposing frame. Where others might have seen threat in his size, she saw solitude. Where they might have flinched from his scar, she recognized old pain wearing a mask of anger. "I don't waste what the Lord sends," she said softly, meeting his gaze without fear. "And he sent me here, Mr. Boone, through your letter and my prayers." Owen's jaw worked beneath his beard. 5 women have stood where you're standing. 5 have left. Then they weren't the right one. Emily's voice remained gentle but firm. "I'm not them, Mr. Boone. I'm Emily Penrose, and I've come to stay." The wind howled around the cabin's corners, driving snow like white bullets through the air. Owen stood motionless for a long moment, studying her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Finally, he stepped back from the doorway. "Better come in before you freeze solid," he muttered. "But don't unpack. Morning's soon enough to see your mistake." Emily crossed the threshold, feeling the cabin's warmth wrap around her like a blanket. The interior was spare but clean. A plank table, 2 chairs, a pot-bellied stove, and shelves lined with provisions. Everything had its place, speaking of a man who valued order even in his solitude. "You walked up from town?" It wasn't a question. Owen's eyes went to her snow-covered boots. "I did." Emily set her carpet bag down carefully. The driver was concerned about ice on the switchbacks. "Could have waited till morning?" "Could have," Emily agreed, unwrapping her shawl. "But then I'd have spent another night wondering if this was where the Lord meant me to be. Now I know it is." Owen's massive shoulders stiffened. "You know nothing of the sort. I know that your letter spoke truth, just as mine did." Emily began unpacking her supplies, setting them on the table with quiet precision. "I know that this mountain needs someone who sees its beauty, not its isolation. And I know that the Lord doesn't make mistakes, Mr. Boone, even when we don't understand his purposes." She turned to face him fully, her eyes clear and direct. "You wrote that there's room here for a woman who isn't afraid of honest work and quiet evenings. Well, here I stand, plain as day and twice as determined. You can send me away if you choose, but you'll have to do better than warning me about wasted time." Something flickered in Owen's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or reluctant respect. He moved to the stove, adding a log with careful hands that belied their size. "Coffee's hot," he said gruffly. "Reckon you could use some after that climb?" "Thank you." Emily accepted the tin cup he offered, warming her fingers against its sides. "And thank you for the honest welcome, Mr. Boone. I'd rather have truth, however rough, than pretty lies any day." Owen leaned against the wall, watching as she sipped her coffee. The lamplight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, the laugh lines at the corners of her eyes. She wasn't young or beautiful by any common measure, but there was something in her calm presence that made his cabin feel different, less like a fortress and more like what it was meant to be. A home. "It won't be easy here," he said finally. "Winter's long. Town's far. Folks don't come calling much." Emily set her cup down with a gentle click. "I've never asked for easy, Mr. Boone. I've asked for purpose, for honest work, and for a chance to serve where I'm needed. The Lord has led me here, and I aim to stay unless you tell me plain that you want me gone." Outside, the wind's voice rose and fell like distant hymns. Inside, the stove's warmth wrapped around them both, filling the silence that stretched between them. Owen straightened slowly from the wall, his height making the cabin's ceiling seem lower. "There's a spare room through that door," he said at last, pointing. "Got a bed and a chest of drawers. It's yours for tonight at least." Emily nodded, gathering her carpetbag. "Thank you, Mr. Boone. I'll see you in the morning." As she moved toward the room, Owen's voice stopped her. "Miss Penrose?" She turned, one hand on the doorframe. "Yes? What made you come, really? After everything you must have heard about this place. About me?" Emily considered her answer carefully. "Because your letter told the truth about who you are, Mr. Boone, and because sometimes the Lord puts a certainty in your heart that's stronger than any fear or doubt. I may not know all that lies ahead, but I know I'm where I'm meant to be." She disappeared into the spare room, closing the door softly behind her. Owen stood for a long while, staring at where she had been, listening to the quiet sounds of her settling in. Outside, snow continued to fall, but for the first time in years, his cabin didn't feel like a shelter against the world. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something he didn't quite dare to name. In her room, Emily knelt beside the narrow bed, her prayer quiet but fervent. "Thank you, Lord, for safe passage. Thank you for this shelter, and thank you for bringing me where I'm needed, even if Mr. Boone doesn't know it yet. Guide us both in what's to come. Amen." The wind sang its endless song around the cabin's eaves, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its mate. But inside, warmth held against the cold, and two souls who had known too much loneliness began the slow work of learning to trust in something larger than their fears. Owen stepped aside, his massive frame casting long shadows in the lamplight as Emily entered. The cabin's warmth wrapped around her, but beneath it lay the musty scent of disuse and loneliness. Wood smoke hung thick in the air, mingling with the sharper smell of unwashed dishes and old coffee grounds. She set her carpetbag down carefully, taking in the cabin's interior with quiet attention. A rough-hewn table dominated the main room, its surface scattered with crumbs and coffee stains. The hearth needed sweeping, ash spilling onto the wooden floor. Tin plates sat unwashed in a basin, and dust had settled on the windowsills like gray snow. Without comment or criticism, Emily removed her snow-dusted shawl and hung it near the pot-bellied stove. Her movements were unhurried but purposeful as she rolled up her sleeves. "Where do you keep your broom, Mr. Boone?" Owen's brow furrowed. "Behind the door. But you needn't—" "I know I needn't," Emily said softly, "but work keeps hands busy and hearts steady." She retrieved the broom and began sweeping the hearth with careful strokes. and a clean hearth makes for better cooking. Owen watched her work, his expression unreadable. The broom whispered across the floorboards, gathering ash and dust into neat piles. Emily's movements were graceful despite her size, each sweep precise and thorough. When the hearth was clean, she turned her attention to the dishes. "The pump's frozen," Owen said gruffly. "There's melted snow in that. Bucket." Emily nodded her thanks, filling the wash basin with fresh water. She worked quietly, efficiently, the clink of tin plates and cups the only sound besides the crackling fire. Owen remained by the door, as if unsure whether to stay or flee. Once the dishes were dried and stored, Emily surveyed the kitchen area. "Do you have coffee, Mr. Boone? And perhaps some salt pork?" "Top shelf." He gestured toward a rough-built cupboard. "Pork's in the stone crock." Emily found the supplies and set about preparing their meal. The coffee pot bubbled cheerfully on the stove, while salt pork sizzled in the cast-iron skillet. Savory aromas began to replace the stale air, transforming the cabin's atmosphere. Owen finally moved from his post by the door, settling into a chair at the table. His large hands rested on the newly cleaned surface, fingers tracing the wood grain absently. Emily worked without chatter, but the silence felt companionable, rather than strained. When the food was ready, she served it simply on the clean plates. Crisp salt pork, the last of a loaf of bread she'd brought from town, and steaming coffee in tin cups. Owen watched as she set his portion before him, then took her own seat across the table. "You can sleep in the lean-to tonight," he said abruptly. "Wagon comes back through tomorrow or the next day. It'll take you back to town." Emily nodded, accepting his words without argument. "Thank you for the shelter, Mr. Boone." She folded her hands and bowed her head. "Shall we pray?" Owen's jaw tightened, but he didn't object. Emily's voice filled the cabin, clear and steady. "Lord, we thank you for this food and for the roof above us. Thank you for safe passage through the storm and for bringing us to this table together. Bless this meal and those who share it. Guide our hearts in your wisdom. Amen." She began to eat quietly, savoring each bite as if it were fine fare instead of humble trail food. Owen watched her for a moment before picking up his own fork. The familiar taste of salt pork seemed different somehow, transformed by the clean plates and the woman's calm presence. As they ate, Emily began to hum softly, an old hymn that spoke of grace and shelter. The melody wrapped around them like a warm shawl, filling the corners of the cabin where shadows had lingered. Owen's shoulders tensed at first, then gradually relaxed as the familiar tune worked its way past his defenses. The hymn stirred something deep within him, memories of Sunday mornings long ago, his mother's voice raised in praise, his father's weathered Bible open on calloused hands. Things he'd thought buried too deep to touch. Yet here they were, called forth by this woman's gentle humming. Unable to bear the weight of those memories, Owen pushed back from the table. The chair legs scraped harshly against the floor, breaking the hymn's spell. Without a word, he grabbed his coat and axe, heading for the door. "Mr. Boone?" Emily's voice stopped him with his hand on the latch. "The woodpile's full already. I noticed when I arrived." "Never hurts to have extra," he muttered, and stepped out into the gathering dark. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he welcomed it. Better the bite of winter than the warmth of memories he'd tried so hard to forget. He made his way to the chopping block, already nearly hidden under fresh snow. The white flakes fell silently, dusting his shoulders and beard as he positioned a log and swung the axe. The rhythmic thunk of steel against wood echoed across the yard. Owen chopped mechanically, splitting logs that weren't needed, trying to drive out the sound of that hymn with physical labor. But the melody lingered, weaving through his mind like smoke, carrying with it the scent of his mother's Sunday dinner and the feel of his father's hand on his shoulder. Snow continued to fall, transforming the night into a white curtain that muffled all sound except the steady swing of his axe. Through the cabin's window, lamplight glowed warm and inviting, no longer the harsh glare of solitude, but something softer, something that spoke of home. Owen paused, breathing hard, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Behind him, Emily's shadow moved across the window as she finished cleaning their supper dishes. The hymn had stopped, but its echo remained, stirring things he'd thought long dead. Hope, perhaps, or the memory of it. He looked down at the pile of split wood, far more than needed for such a night. His hands ached from gripping the axe handle, and snow had soaked through his coat. Still, he lingered in the darkness, caught between the urge to flee further into the night and the pull of that warm lamplight. Inside, he could hear Emily moving about, her footsteps sure and steady on the wooden floor. The cabin no longer smelled of smoke and neglect. Somehow, in the space of an evening, she'd begun to transform it with nothing more than soap, water, and that quiet hymn. The snow fell harder now, adding another layer to the white blanket that covered everything. Owen stood in the swirling flakes, watching his home through new eyes. The cabin seemed different with a woman's presence inside. Not just cleaned, but awakened somehow, as if it had been sleeping all these years and was finally starting to stir. He gathered an armload of the freshly split wood, though the box by the stove was already full. It would give him a reason to go back inside, to step once more into that transformed space where memories waited like patient ghosts. The night deepened around him, and snow continued to fall, erasing his tracks and softening all the hard edges of his solitary world. Something was changing, as surely as winter would eventually yield to spring. Owen wasn't sure he was ready for it, but standing in the darkness, he realized it might not matter if he was ready or not. Change had arrived on his doorstep, in the form of a calm-voiced woman who cleaned hearths and hummed hymns. And like the falling snow, it was covering his carefully constructed isolation with something new, something that might, given time and trust, bring life to what had long been frozen. The mountain sunrise painted golden streaks across fresh snow. Inside the cabin, Emily woke early, her breath visible in the cold air. She pulled her shawl tight and quietly added wood to the banked coals in the stove. The familiar scent of coffee would make a proper welcome for the day. Through the window, she watched Owen trudge through knee-deep drifts to check his mule. His broad shoulders carried the weight of winters spent alone, but there was grace in his careful movements with the animals. Emily smiled, remembering her mother's words about judging a man's character by how he treated God's creatures. When Owen returned, stamping snow from his boots, he found the cabin warming and coffee ready. Emily had already swept the main room and was eyeing the wooden floor with determination. "That floor ain't worth the trouble," Owen muttered, accepting a steaming cup. "Every floor's worth caring for," Emily replied, gathering her scrub brush and bucket. "It holds us up, doesn't it?" Owen watched as she knelt on the rough planks, her strong arms working the brush in steady circles. The wood gradually brightened, years of ground-in dirt surrendering to soap and persistence. She hummed while she worked, not a hymn this time, but something gentle that reminded Owen of spring creeks and new leaves. Near midday, Emily discovered a pile of Owen's shirts stuffed behind a trunk. They were more patch than original fabric, with buttons hanging by threads and seams split at the shoulders. She settled into the chair by the window, needle flashing in the winter light. "Don't need to do that," Owen protested, pausing in his own work of fixing a broken chair leg. Emily held up one particularly sorry specimen. "The Lord gives us skills to help others, Mr. Boone. My hands know their purpose with needle and thread." Her capable fingers moved steadily, mending tears and reinforcing weak spots. She worked without commentary on the shirt's condition, treating each garment with the same careful attention she'd given the floor. Owen found himself watching her more than his carpentry, noticed how the sunlight caught silver threads in her dark hair. When afternoon shadows lengthened, Owen went to fetch water from the creek. The path was treacherous with ice, requiring careful steps and balance. He'd made this trip countless times alone, but today felt different. The 2 buckets seemed lighter, knowing they'd be used for more than just his solitary needs. Back at the cabin, Emily had finished with his shirts and was studying his meager stock of provisions. "I could teach you to bake bread," she offered. "Fresh bread makes any meal better." Owen grunted non-committally, but found himself watching as she measured flour into his mother's old mixing bowl. Her movements were sure and practiced, kneading the dough with strong hands that knew their work. The cabin filled with the forgotten scent of baking bread, calling up memories he'd thought long buried. Later, as Emily cleared away the supper dishes, Owen brought in more firewood. He paused in the doorway, struck by how different the cabin looked after just one day of a woman's care. The floors gleamed softly in the lamplight, his mended shirts hung neatly by the fire, and the air held the lingering warmth of fresh bread. The next morning established a pattern. Emily rose early to tend the fire and start coffee. Owen cared for his mule and checked his trap lines. They worked separately but aware of each other, like dancers learning a careful pavane of shared space. On the 3rd day, Owen found Emily struggling with an armload of wood, determined but awkward in her handling of the heavy logs. "Here," he said gruffly, taking the wood. "That ain't women's work." Emily brushed snow from her skirts. "Then perhaps you might show me proper way with kindling. Seems sensible to know how." Owen hesitated, then nodded. He demonstrated how to split the smaller pieces, showing her the right angle for the hatchet and where to place her hands. Emily listened carefully, her face intent with concentration. When she tried herself, her first attempts were clumsy but determined. "Like this?" she asked, adjusting her grip. "Bit higher on the handle," Owen corrected, surprised to find himself teaching rather than dismissing. "Gives better control." By the 5th day, Emily could split kindling nearly as well as she could fold laundry. She'd shown Owen her own method for folding shirts, a simple technique that prevented wrinkles and saved space. He'd resisted at first, but her patient demonstrations proved its worth. "See?" she said, smoothing the last crease. "No need for anger with cloth. It responds better to gentle hands." Owen caught himself nodding, remembering times he'd wadded clothes into corners in frustration. Emily's way was better, though he wasn't ready to admit it aloud. The 7th day dawned clear and cold. Emily had established herself so naturally in the cabin's rhythms that Owen found himself watching her work, trying to imagine the space without her presence. The thought left an uncomfortable hollow in his chest. That evening, as Emily served their supper, Owen cleared his throat. "Wagon won't be through for another week, likely. Roads are bad with snow." He studied his plate intently. "Reckon you might as well stay till then. No sense risking the trail." Emily's quiet, "Thank you, Mr. Boone," held no triumph, only simple gratitude. After the dishes were done, she settled into what had become her chair by the fire. The first notes of "Abide with me" rose soft and clear in the evening air. Owen took his usual place by the window, whittling tool in hand. Snow began to swirl outside, catching the lamplight like falling stars. In the glass, He could see Emily's reflection as she sang, her face peaceful, her hands folded in her lap. The familiar hymn filled the cabin with memories of faith and family, things he'd thought forever lost to time and grief. His hands moved automatically over the piece of wood he held, but his eyes remained fixed on that reflection. Emily's voice carried all the warmth of home, all the peace he'd forgotten could exist in this harsh mountain world. The snow fell thicker now, wrapping the cabin in white silence, broken only by her gentle singing. Owen realized his whittling had stilled, the knife motionless in his calloused hands. In the window's reflection, Emily's image blurred slightly, like a painting seen through water. He blinked, surprised to find his eyes burning with unexpected moisture. The hymn's final notes faded into the quiet evening. Emily reached for her mending basket, contentedly sorting through the day's work. Owen remained at his window, watching her reflection as she sewed by lamplight, her presence as natural as the snow falling outside or the fire crackling on the hearth. Change had come to the mountain cabin, arriving not with trumpets and demands, but with a scrub brush and a gentle hymn. Owen felt it working in him like spring thaw in frozen ground, slow, inevitable, and full of uncertain promise. He turned the half-whittled piece of wood in his hands, acknowledging that his carefully constructed solitude had already begun to crack, letting in light he thought he'd forgotten how to see. The mountain air bit sharp and clean as dawn crept over the ridge. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, laying a pristine blanket across Owen's homestead. Emily was already up, stoking the cook stove's embers, when the sound cut through the morning stillness. The steady rhythm of approaching hooves crunching through frozen snow. Owen lifted his head from where he'd been checking the cabin's root cellar inventory. His shoulders tensed at the unfamiliar noise. No one rode up here without purpose, especially not this early in winter. Through the cabin's frosted window, they watched a tall figure on horseback emerge from the tree line. The rider's dark coat was stiff with frost, his badge catching the weak morning light as he dismounted. Deputy Thomas Cray moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. "Best see what brings him," Emily said softly, reaching for her shawl. "I'll put coffee on." Owen nodded, his jaw tight. He stepped onto the porch, boots creaking against wood that Emily had scrubbed clean just days before. The deputy was securing his horse to the hitching post, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Mighty early for social calls, Deputy," Owen said, his voice carrying across the yard. Cray straightened, adjusting his coat. His movements were stiff from the cold ride. "Official business, Boone, from the territorial office." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope, its paper bearing an official seal. The mark of the O. Silverton Mining Concern pressed into red wax. Owen's stomach knotted. Nothing good ever came with that seal, not in his experience. He'd seen too many small holders pushed off their land by mining company papers and territorial court orders. The deputy climbed the porch steps, his spurs ringing against wood. He held out the envelope, but before Owen could take it, the cabin door opened behind them. Emily stepped out, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Deputy Cray," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You must be half frozen. Won't you step inside?" Surprise flickered across Cray's weathered face. He clearly hadn't expected to find Emily still at the cabin. His eyes darted between her and Owen before he gave a curt nod. "Much obliged, ma'am." Inside, Emily poured more coffee, while Owen broke the seal on the envelope. The paper inside was crisp, official, and damning. Owen's fingers tightened on the document as he read, his face darkening like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. "This can't be legal," he growled, slapping the paper down on the table. That stream's been part of this homestead since before the territory was mapped. Deputy Cray sipped his coffee, his expression carefully neutral. New survey says different. According to these papers, the water rights belong to the Silverton Mining Concern. They're claiming the stream feeds their new operation downstream. Been watering my stock from that creek for 15 years. Owen's voice was dangerous and low. Built this place around it. Without that water, this land's worth nothing, and they know it. Emily moved closer, reading the document over Owen's shoulder. Her calm presence seemed to steady him, though his hands still clenched into fists at his sides. The company's offering fair compensation, Cray continued, setting down his cup. More than the land's worth, considering the elevation and winter isolation. Fair? Owen barked out a harsh laugh. There's nothing fair about theft dressed up in legal papers. The deputy's face hardened. Listen here, Boone. I'm just delivering the notice. You've got two choices: accept the company's offer or challenge it in territorial court. But if you're thinking of handling this with that rifle by your door, remember I've got deputies who'd be happy to ride up here and enforce the law. Emily laid a gentle hand on Owen's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. When would the hearing be? She asked Cray, her voice level and practical. 3 days' time, down in Silverton. The deputy studied her with newfound interest. Judge Crawford's circuit court is in session this week, but Boone'll need proof of his claim. Original survey markers, water rights documentation, something more than just years of usage. Owen's laugh was bitter. Documentation burned with half the county records in the courthouse fire 4 years back. Mining company knows that well enough. Then you'll need to find other ways to prove your claim, Cray said, standing. He adjusted his gun belt, a subtle reminder of his authority. Fight this in court, Boone, not with a rifle. That's friendly advice. Emily's voice cut through the tension like a shaft of sunlight. Then to town we'll go. She spoke with such simple certainty that both men turned to look at her. The Lord helps those who seek justice through proper channels. Deputy Cray's eyebrows rose slightly as he studied her. Owen could see the man reassessing the situation, wondering perhaps what sort of woman would stand so firmly beside a mountain recluse in his fight against the mining company. Ma'am? Cray touched his hat brim, then turned to Owen. You've got 3 days to file your challenge or accept the offer. After that, the company's claim stands. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. Don't make me come back up here with more deputies, Boone. Wouldn't end well for anyone. They watched from the porch as the deputy mounted up and rode away, his figure gradually disappearing into the trees. The morning sun had risen higher now, making the snow blindingly bright, but Owen felt only darkness gathering around him. Emily touched his arm again. Come inside. The coffee's still hot, and we need to think this through properly. Owen followed her numbly, sinking into a chair by the fireplace. The warrant lay on the table like a snake in their midst, its official seal gleaming dully in the morning light. Emily busied herself stoking the fire and adding fresh coffee to his cup, her movements sure and steady despite the tension in the air. There must be a way to prove your claim, she said finally, settling into her own chair. Surely someone in town remembers when you first settled here, when the water rights were established. Owen stared into the flames, his voice rough. Old Jim Cooper might remember. He helped survey these parts before the mining companies moved in, but he's been dead these 3 years past. He ran a hand through his beard. Most folks who knew the truth about these mountains are gone now, one way or another. The fire crackled and popped, throwing shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, a jay called harsh and clear in the morning air, but inside the cabin silence stretched between them like a drawn wire. My pa always said a man's word used to mean something in these parts, Owen said finally, his voice bitter. Now it's all paper and seals and company lawyers twisting the truth to suit themselves. Emily's hands were steady as she picked up her mending from beside the chair, one of Owen's shirts still waiting for new buttons. Then we'll find a way to make the truth speak louder than their papers. Owen watched her capable fingers working the needle through fabric, remembering how she'd faced down every challenge this past week with the same quiet determination. From scrubbing floors to splitting kindling, she'd met each task with grace and persistence. But this was different. This was his battle, his land at stake. The thought of Emily being drawn into his fight with the mining company sat like lead in his stomach. She'd already stayed longer than he'd intended, bringing light and order to his solitary world. He couldn't ask her to stand beside him against the territory's most powerful men. The day wore on, sun tracking across the snow-bright sky outside. Emily went about her usual tasks, baking bread, tidying the cabin, humming hymns under her breath. But Owen sat by the fire, turning the problem over and over in his mind like a worry stone worn smooth by years of handling. As evening settled over the mountain, Emily lit the lamps and served a simple supper. Owen barely tasted the food, his thoughts still circling like wolves around a wounded deer. The warrant lay where he'd left it on the table, its official seal catching the lamplight like an accusing eye. After the dishes were cleared away, Emily took up her usual place by the fire with her mending basket. But tonight, no hymns filled the cabin's silence. Owen sat in his chair by the window, watching the fire die down to glowing coals, torn between pride that demanded action and fear that whispered of failure. The mining company had broken stronger men than him, he knew. They had money and lawyers and the territory's courts in their pocket. All he had was 15 years of hard work, a stream he couldn't prove he owned, and a woman's quiet faith that justice could still be found in Silverton's courthouse. Outside, snow began falling again, adding fresh layers to the white blanket covering his threatened land. Owen watched the flakes swirl in the darkness beyond the window, feeling the weight of decision pressing down like winter storm clouds heavy with snow. The mountain air bit sharp and clean as Owen stepped out into the pale dawn light. Frost coated the wagon seat, and his breath formed thick clouds in the early morning chill. He'd spent most of the night organizing papers, searching through old letters and documents for anything that might help prove his claim. The results lay bundled in oilcloth beneath the wagon seat, pitifully thin evidence against the mining company's team of lawyers. Emily emerged from the cabin carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle of journey bread and dried beef. She'd risen before him, as she had every morning this past week, to prepare for their descent to Silverton. Her shawl was pulled tight against the cold, but her eyes were bright with purpose. "The coffee's hot," she said, setting the food bundle in the wagon. "Best to warm ourselves before starting down." Owen nodded, grateful for the excuse to delay their departure a few minutes more. Inside, Emily poured the strong brew into tin cups while Owen checked his saddlebags one final time. The familiar routine of morning coffee had become a comfort he hadn't expected to find in her presence. "The livestock is fed," he said, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "Should manage fine for 3 days with extra hay in the barn." Emily sipped her coffee, watching him over the rim. "The Lord will watch over them while we're gone." Owen grunted, not willing to argue about God's attention to barn animals. The mining company's warrant lay heavy in his coat pocket, a constant reminder of why they were making this journey. He'd rather face a mountain lion than a courthouse full of lawyers, but Emily's quiet certainty made him feel somehow less alone in the fight. Outside, his old mule stamped impatiently in the traces. The wagon was loaded with enough supplies for several days in town: grain for the mule, food for themselves, and the precious bundle of papers that might save his land. Owen helped Emily up onto the high seat, noting how she managed the climb with dignity despite her size. She settled her skirts around her and adjusted her shawl against the wind. The sun was just touching the eastern peaks as Owen clucked to the mule and turned the wagon down the mountain trail. The road twisted through stands of pine and aspen, their branches heavy with fresh snow. In places, the way narrowed dangerous close to the edge, where the land fell away hundreds of feet to the valley below. Emily gripped the seat rail but made no sound as the wagon wheels slipped in the half-frozen ruts. Owen guided the mule with practiced hands, reading the road's treachery in the way ice gleamed between stones and slush, deepened in the shadowed places. They passed the spot where last week's mail-order bride had turned back, her delicate shoes unsuited for mountain travel. Emily's sturdy boots and calm demeanor told a different story. The morning wore on as they descended, the sun climbing higher but providing little warmth. Wind whistled through the trees, bringing the scent of snow. Owen kept one eye on the gathering clouds. A storm now could turn their journey deadly. Near midday, they reached the creek crossing where the trail leveled briefly. Owen pulled the wagon to a stop, knowing both mule and passengers needed rest. Emily unpacked coffee and journey bread, while Owen checked the wagon wheels for damage. "The water sings even in winter," Emily observed, settling on a fallen log near the creek bank. She poured coffee into their cups, steam rising in the cold air. "Like it's praising its maker." Owen accepted the cup, but frowned at her words. "God forgot these hills long ago," he muttered, staring at the tumbling water that the mining company claimed as their own. "Left them to the greed of men and the law of the strong." "The Lord forgets nothing he created," Emily replied softly. She broke the journey bread and offered him half. "Every sparrow that falls, every stream that flows, he knows them all." Owen took the bread, but said nothing. Her faith was like a lamp in darkness, steady and warm, but his own beliefs had frozen solid years ago, like creek ice in deepest winter. Still, watching her quiet certainty as she sipped her coffee, he felt something shift inside him, like spring thaw beginning in some long-buried place. They continued downward as afternoon shadows lengthened across the trail. The wagon creaked and swayed, wheels finding every rut and stone. Emily hummed hymns under her breath, the sound barely carrying over the mule's plodding hooves. Owen found himself listening for her voice whenever it paused, missing the melody that somehow made the journey less lonely. Dusk was gathering when they finally reached Silverton's outskirts. Lamplight gleamed through frosted windows, and smoke rose straight up from chimney stacks in the still evening air. The mining company's office stood dark and empty, its brass nameplate catching the last rays of sunset. Owen's hands tightened on the reins as they passed. They found rooms above Whitaker's mercantile, two narrow spaces separated by a thin wall. The elderly shopkeeper's wife showed them up, clucking sympathetically at their road-weary appearance. "Bathroom's down the hall," she explained, lighting the oil lamps. "Breakfast at 7 if you want it." Emily thanked her warmly while Owen carried in their bags. The rooms were spare but clean, each containing a narrow cot, a washstand, and a hook for clothes. A single window in each room looked out over Silverton's main street, where evening crowds still moved between saloon and store. "We should rest well," Emily said, untying her bonnet. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Owen nodded, suddenly awkward in the close quarters. He'd grown used to sharing his cabin with Emily, but these narrow rooms made him acutely aware of her presence in a way the mountain's open spaces hadn't. "I'll check on the mule," he said, needing escape. "Make sure he's settled for the night." When he returned, Emily had laid out a simple supper on a small table between their rooms: bread, cheese, and dried fruit from their travel supplies. She'd removed her heavy skirt, but kept her shawl wrapped tight, modest even in their private quarters. They ate in comfortable silence, listening to the muted sounds of the town below. Occasionally, a burst of laughter would drift up from the saloon, or the stamp of horses' hooves would echo on the packed dirt street. It all seemed very far from the peace of Owen's mountain cabin. After supper, Emily took out her Bible and settled on her cot to read by lamplight. The familiar ritual of her evening prayers carried through the thin wall to where Owen lay on his own narrow bed, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams. He could hear her soft voice shaping words of faith and hope, asking for guidance in tomorrow's trial. Sleep eluded him as the town gradually grew quiet. The weight of tomorrow's court appearance pressed down like a physical thing, squeezing breath from his lungs. He thought of the mining company's lawyers, of their polished arguments and official papers. What chance did he have against such forces, armed only with his truth and Emily's prayers? Through the wall, he heard Emily's steady breathing, already deep in peaceful sleep. Her faith seemed to fill both their rooms, as real as the lamplight that still flickered against the ceiling. Owen envied her that certainty, that sure knowledge of God's presence even here, so far from their mountain refuge. The night crept forward, marked by the town hall clock striking hours. Owen listened to Emily's quiet breathing, finding unexpected comfort in the sound. Whatever tomorrow brought, he was no longer facing it alone. That thought followed him down into uneasy dreams, where mountain streams sang hymns, and justice wore Emily's gentle smile. Morning light crept over Silverton's snow-dusted rooftops as Owen and Emily made their way down the boardwalk toward the sheriff's office. The town was already stirring, storekeepers sweeping their steps, women hurrying to market with baskets on their arms, miners trudging toward the dark mouth of the valley where the Silverton mining concern held sway. Owen walked stiffly in his clean shirt and pressed trousers, unused to such formal attire. Beside him, Emily moved with quiet grace despite her travel-worn dress. She'd mended a torn seam that morning, her skilled fingers working quickly by lamplight, while Owen paced their rented rooms. The whispers started as soon as they turned onto Main Street. "Lord above, look at the size of him," a woman muttered behind her hand. "Like a grizzly bear in Sunday clothes." Her companion snickered. "And her? Round as a barrel. What a pair they make." Owen's shoulders tensed at each barely concealed comment. His hands curled into fists at his sides, but Emily's presence beside him kept his anger in check. She walked with her head high, as if the cruel words were merely wind through prairie grass. The sheriff's office squatted at the corner of Pine and Mountain Streets, its weathered sign creaking in the morning breeze. Through the frosted windows, they could see Sheriff Thomas Morton at his desk, boots propped up as he read the morning newspaper. A bell jangled as they entered. The sheriff looked up, his thin mouth twisting into a smirk as he took in the unlikely pair before him. "Well now," Morton drawled, folding his paper with deliberate slowness. "If it ain't Beauty and the Beast come down from Widow's Hill." He chuckled at his own wit. "Though I reckon I'll let you two sort out which is which." Emily stepped forward before Owen could respond. "Good morning, Sheriff Morton. We've come about the water rights dispute with the mining company." Morton's smirk didn't waver. "Have you now? And what makes you think there's anything to dispute? Company's got their papers all signed and sealed." "We'd like to examine the deed registry, if you please," Emily said politely, "to verify the proper boundaries of Mr. Boone's claim." The sheriff made a show of considering this reasonable request. "County clerk's office is in the courthouse, though I don't reckon you'll find what you're hoping for." He turned his attention to Owen. Might save yourself some trouble, Boone, just accepting the company's offer, before things get complicated. Owen felt his jaw tighten, but Emily's hand brushed his arm, the lightest touch, yet enough to steady him. "We appreciate your time, Sheriff," she said, already turning towards the door. Outside, the morning had grown warmer, though clouds were building over the western peaks. They walked the 3 blocks to the courthouse in silence, Owen's long strides matching Emily's shorter steps. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building with pretensions of grandeur, columns flanking the entrance, copper gutters gone green with age. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old paper. Their boots echoed on the wooden floors as they followed signs to the clerk's office. The clerk was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and wire-rimmed spectacles. He barely glanced up from his ledger as Emily explained their errand. With obvious reluctance, he pulled out the massive deed registry and began turning pages. "Boone. Boone," he muttered. "Ah, here's something." He adjusted his spectacles. "Partial claim filed in 62, but the signature?" He squinted at the page. "That's not your writing, is it?" Owen leaned forward to look. The handwriting was spidery and unfamiliar. "No, that ain't mine." The clerk shrugged. "Well, there you have it. Company's got their survey maps and a team of Denver lawyers. You've got..." He gestured at the unclear signature. "This. Not much of a case, if you ask me." Emily thanked him with the same gentle courtesy she'd shown the sheriff. "You've been most helpful. We appreciate you taking the time to look." Outside the courthouse, Owen's frustration finally boiled over. He slammed his fist against a hitching post, making the iron ring. 7 years I've worked that land. 7 years! And now some company man with a fountain pen can take it all? Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a paper-wrapped biscuit. "Here," she said, holding it out to him. "You haven't eaten since dawn." The simple gesture, her thinking of his needs even now, deflated some of his anger. He took the biscuit, suddenly aware of how hungry he was. "We'll find truth before anger does," Emily said softly. "The Lord doesn't sleep, even when justice seems to." Owen ate the biscuit in thoughtful silence. Around them, the town went about its business, wagons creaking past, children running errands, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. All of it felt unreal, like a dream that had no connection to his mountain home and the creek that sang through his land. "I need to think," he said finally. "Walk a spell, clear my head." Emily nodded. "I'll visit Reverend Sanders while you do. He might remember something about the original land grants, being here so long." She straightened her shawl. "Meet me at Whitaker's for supper?" Owen agreed, watching as she made her way toward the small, white church at the edge of town. Even now, after the morning's defeats, she moved with purpose and dignity. The townspeople's mockery seemed to slide off her like water from a duck's back. He walked for hours, through every street of Silverton, past the mining company's office with its polished brass sign, up to the edge of town where the mountains rose sharp against the sky. His land was up there, his home, the life he'd built with his own hands. The thought of losing it all to some legal trick made his chest tight with fury, but Emily's words kept coming back to him. "We'll find truth before anger does." Her steady faith was like a compass pointing true north, while his anger just spun him in circles. He'd seen how she met cruelty with kindness, mockery with grace. Somehow, her way seemed to hold more power than all his rage and fear. The afternoon was fading when he finally turned back toward town. The clouds had thickened, promising snow by nightfall. Light glowed in the church windows as he passed, and he could hear Emily's voice mingled with the preacher's, though he couldn't make out the words. She was talking to Reverend Sanders, the man who'd first arranged the mail-order marriages that brought women to the mountain. the same preacher who'd finally given up on Owen, saying no more brides would be sent his way. Yet Emily had come anyway, carrying hope like a lantern into his dark cabin. Owen waited outside Whitaker's Mercantile, watching the lamplighter make his rounds. When Emily appeared, her cheeks were pink from the cold, and her eyes bright with something that looked like hope. "Reverend Sanders remembers when the first claims were filed," she said, as they climbed the stairs to their rooms. "He's going to look through the church records tonight. Sometimes the old circuit-riding preachers kept better notes than the county clerks." She didn't push Owen to talk about his long walk or scold him for his earlier outburst. Instead, she simply set about preparing their simple supper, humming softly as she worked. Her calm presence filled the narrow room like lamplight, pushing back the shadows of doubt and fear. Looking at her now, Owen could hardly believe she was the same woman who'd arrived on his doorstep just weeks ago. She'd grown stronger somehow, more certain of her place in the world. Or maybe she'd always been strong, and he was only now beginning to see it. The town's mockery, beauty, and the beast, the sheriff had sneered, seemed hollow now. They'd meant to wound with those words, to make Owen and Emily feel like creatures out of place in the civilized world. But Emily's grace had turned their cruelty back on itself, revealing the true beauty of a gentle spirit and the beastliness of those who would mock it. As they ate their simple meal, Owen found himself studying Emily's face in the lamplight. There was something there he'd never seen in any of the other mail-order brides. Not beauty in the way town folks measured it, but something deeper. Something that made him think of mountain streams and steady lamplight and the kind of truth that outlasted anger. Night settled over Silverton, bringing the promised snow. Through the thin wall between their rooms, Owen could hear Emily's evening prayers, as familiar now as the sound of wind in pine trees. He lay awake long after she finished, thinking about justice and faith and the strange ways the Lord worked his will in the world. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe truth would find a way before anger could. And maybe, just maybe, she was the compass he needed to find his way through this fight. Emily stepped into the warmth of the parsonage, gratefully accepting Reverend Hale's invitation to sit by the crackling fire. The parlor was modest but welcoming, with well-worn furniture and shelves lined with leather-bound books. A kettle whistled on the wood stove, and soon the Reverend handed her a steaming cup of tea. "I remember when Owen Boone first came to these parts," Reverend Hale said, settling into his own chair. His eyes grew distant with memory. "Must have been, about 8 years ago now. Tallest man I'd ever seen. But there was something gentle about him, despite his size." Emily wrapped her cold fingers around the warm cup. "He doesn't speak much of those days?" "No, he wouldn't." The Reverend stirred his tea thoughtfully. "He worked for the Silverton Mining Company back then. Good worker, they said. Strong as an ox and twice as reliable. But then—" He paused, considering his words carefully. "Something happened?" Emily prompted softly. Reverend Hale nodded. "There was a Ute family living near one of the claims the company wanted. Good people. I'd visited their camp often, brought medicine when their children were sick. The company decided they needed that land, claimed they had some territorial grant." His voice grew heavy with old anger. "They sent men to force them out. Owen was there that day." Emily could picture it. The quiet mountain morning shattered by violence. "What did he do?" "He stood between the company men and that family. Gave them time to gather their belongings, at least. The foreman didn't take kindly to that kind of defiance." The Reverend touched his own face, indicating where Owen's scar lay. "He left the company's employ that same day. Took up his claim on Widow's Hill not long after." Emily sat quietly, absorbing this new understanding of the silent man she'd come to know. The scar she'd noticed, but never asked about. It wasn't just a mark of violence, but a badge of conscience. "That's why he's so feared in town," she said slowly. "Not because he's dangerous, but because he stood up to them." "The company doesn't forget such things," Reverend Hale agreed. "And now they're coming for his land, too." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "But you should know, Mrs. Penrose, Owen Boone may be a hard man, but he's a righteous one. I've seen him ride 20 miles in a blizzard to help a stranger with a lame horse. Seen him share his last flour with hungry travelers. The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing you to his door." Outside, the wind was picking up, driving dark clouds before it. Emily finished her tea and thanked the Reverend for his time. As she stood to leave, he pressed a worn Bible into her hands. "Take this," he said. "It belonged to the circuit rider who first came through these parts. There might be notes about the early land claims in its margins. And," he smiled gently, "perhaps its words will reach places where human voices can't." The walk back to the inn was bitter cold, snow beginning to sting her face. Emily found Owen waiting in the narrow hallway between their rooms, his expression troubled. Without a word, she opened her door and gestured for him to enter. The room was small but warm, a coal fire glowing in the tiny grate. Emily lit the lamp and set the Reverend's Bible on the rough table. Owen stood by the window, watching the snow swirl past. "The Reverend told me about the Ute family," she said quietly. "About what you did." Owen's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. For a long moment, only the wind spoke, rattling the window panes. "Wasn't enough," he finally said, his voice rough. "They still lost their land, their home. You tried. That matters." "Does it?" Now he did turn, his face half in shadow. "They still had to leave, just like these mining men want me to leave now." Emily moved closer, close enough to see the old pain in his eyes. "You stood up for what was right. That's why they fear you still, because you showed them what justice looks like." Owen's laugh was bitter. "Justice? Where was justice that day? Where is it now?" "Sometimes justice takes time, like a seed that needs winter before it can grow." Emily reached out slowly and placed her hand over his, where it rested on the windowsill. His skin was cold from the glass. "Then you already know what injustice costs, but you also know what it means to stand against it." Outside, the storm was building in earnest now, snow thick in the darkening air. The wind moaned around the building's corners like a lost soul seeking shelter. "We should pray," Emily said softly. Owen stiffened. "I haven't. Not since that day." "Then it's time." Emily picked up the Reverend's Bible, its leather smooth with years of handling. She opened it to the Psalms, the pages falling naturally to well-read passages. The lamp cast a warm circle around them as she began to read. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Her voice was steady, carrying the ancient words into the storm-wrapped room. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Owen stood silent, but she could feel him listening, really listening, perhaps for the first time in years. The familiar verses continued, speaking of valleys of shadow and tables prepared in the presence of enemies. When she finished reading, Emily bowed her head. "Dear Lord," she prayed, "we come before you tonight seeking guidance and strength. Help us to trust in your justice, even when the path seems dark. Give us courage to stand firm in what's right, and wisdom to know your will." She paused, and in that silence, she heard Owen's voice, low and uncertain at first, but growing stronger. "Lord, I ain't talked to you in a long while. Reckon I've been angry too long, but if you're still listening, His words faltered, then steadied. "Help us find a way through this. Not just for me, but for what's right. And thank you for sending Miss Emily, even if I didn't deserve it." The last words were barely a whisper, but they filled the room like sunrise. Emily kept her eyes closed, tears prickling behind her lids, as Owen's prayer continued, halting but honest, years of silence finally breaking like ice in spring. Outside, the storm raged on, rattling windows and howling down chimneys. But in that small room, with the lamp burning low and their shadows merged on the wall, a different kind of weather was changing. Emily could feel it in the way Owen's hand had turned beneath hers, his fingers now curling around her own. Could hear it in the way his voice grew more certain as he spoke to his long-neglected God. When the prayer ended, neither of them moved for a long moment. The fire had burned down to coals, casting a ruddy glow across the room. Snow plastered the window panes, but they were warm here, in this shelter they'd found together. "Thank you," Owen said finally, his voice rough with emotion, for showing me the way back." Emily squeezed his hand gently. "The Lord never left you, Owen. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us where to look." The storm had effectively trapped them in the inn for the night, but neither seemed to mind. Emily read more from the Psalms, her voice steady against the wind's wail. Owen listened, sometimes closing his eyes, sometimes watching her face in the lamplight. Occasionally he would nod at a particular verse, as if recognizing an old friend. The hours passed, marked only by the need to add coal to the fire and trim the lamp's wick. They talked softly of many things, of Owen's early days in the territory, of Emily's life in Kansas City, of the way faith could be lost and found again. The storm created a pocket of privacy around them, a space where truth could emerge without fear. When Emily finally yawned, Owen rose to leave. At the door, he turned back, his expression open in a way she'd never seen before. "I reckon the Lord does work in mysterious ways," he said quietly, "sending you up that mountain when I'd given up on everything." Emily smiled. "He sends what we need, not always what we think we want." "Yes," Owen agreed, looking at her with new understanding. "Yes, he surely does." After he left, Emily sat for a long time by the dying fire, the Reverend's Bible in her lap. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the wind's voice growing softer. But inside, something was just beginning to bloom, something as fragile as prayer and as strong as truth. She thought of Owen's prayer, how his voice had trembled and then grown sure, like a man finding his footing after a long illness. The mining company might have power and lawyers and territorial grants, but they didn't have this quiet strength that came from knowing what was right and standing firm in that knowledge. Tomorrow they would face the town again, face the mockery and the legal threats. But tonight, in this storm-wrapped room, they had found something that no court could take away, a shared faith in something larger than themselves, and the courage to stand together against injustice. Emily added one last piece of coal to the fire and prepared for bed, the Bible close at hand. The storm's voice had gentled to a lullaby, and warmth filled the small room like a blessing. Morning broke clear and crisp after the storm, the sky washed clean as new starched cotton. Emily stood at the mercantile's counter, her arms dusted with flour as she kneaded another batch of dough. The owner had kindly offered use of the store's big oven, and the smell of baking bread filled the air. "Them orphans ain't had fresh bread in months," Mrs. Miller, the shopkeeper's wife, said, watching Emily shape the loaves. "Right kind of you to think of them." Emily smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear with her wrist. The Lord provides so we can provide for others. She glanced out the window where snow dripped from eaves in the morning sun. Besides, waiting for legal matters gives hands time to work. The bell above the shop door chimed as Owen ducked through, having to bend his tall frame to enter. He carried his toolbox, worn leather straps creaking. "Roof at the church took damage," he said simply. "Thought I might see to it?" Emily nodded, understanding in her eyes. They both knew idle hands bred worry, and there was plenty to worry about with the mining company's threats hanging over them. Outside, the sound of hammering soon echoed down the street. Curious townsfolk paused to watch as Owen's massive figure moved carefully across the church roof, replacing torn shingles and securing loose boards. His movements were deliberate, gentle despite his size. A group of children from the orphanage gathered below, necks craned back to watch. They'd been wary of him at first, the giant from the mountain that adults whispered about. But as the morning wore on, their fear gave way to fascination. "Mister?" one small boy called up. "How come you're so tall?" Owen paused in his work, looking down at the upturned faces. For a moment, Emily, watching from the mercantile window, held her breath. Owen wasn't used to children, to conversation of any kind, really. But his voice, when it came, was soft as falling snow. "Reckon the good Lord needed someone who could reach high places." Children giggled, and soon they were fetching nails and holding the bottom of his ladder, proud to be trusted with such important work. Owen's responses to their endless questions grew easier, his shoulders relaxing as the morning went on. By noon, Emily had a dozen golden loaves cooling on the counter. The smell drew people in, and she wrapped each loaf carefully in clean cloth, adding a bit of butter when she could. Mrs. Miller helped her load them into a basket for the orphanage. "Never thought I'd see the day," the older woman mused, watching through the window as Owen showed a boy how to use a hammer properly. "That man's been a shadow on this town for years. Now look at him." Emily smiled, seeing how naturally Owen's big hands guided the child's smaller ones. Sometimes people just need a chance to show who they truly are. The afternoon passed in peaceful industry. Emily delivered the bread to the orphanage, where eager hands and hungry smiles greeted her. She stayed to teach the girls some simple stitches, their small fingers carefully copying her movements with donated fabric scraps. Owen finished the roof as sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Reverend Hale stood in the churchyard, nodding approval at the solid work. "Fine job, Mr. Boone. We're much obliged." Owen cleaned his tools methodically, the children still hovering nearby. "Least I could do," he said quietly, "after all your help with our situation." The preacher's eyes were kind. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Sometimes a broken roof can mend more than just timber." That evening, as Emily was helping Mrs. Miller close the shop, several townswomen approached with an invitation that surprised her. "We're having supper at the church hall," Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, said. "Sort of a town gathering. We'd be honored if you'd join us." She hesitated, then added, "We heard you know some hymns." Emily accepted graciously, though her heart beat faster at the thought of singing in public. She'd always kept her voice between herself and the Lord, but perhaps this was another way to build bridges. The church hall glowed with lamplight as families gathered, bringing dishes to share. Children darted between tables while their elders gossiped and laughed. Emily felt Owen's presence before she saw him, standing in the doorway like a tree uncertain of its welcome in a garden. But people nodded to him now. Some even smiled. The children he'd helped that morning waved excitedly. He didn't come in, but he didn't leave either, and that itself was a kind of miracle. After the meal, when the plates were cleared and the lamps turned low, someone asked Emily to sing. She stood slowly, smoothing her skirts with suddenly nervous hands. The hall grew quiet, expectant. Her voice trembled on the first note, but then grew stronger, filling the space with familiar words of grace and redemption. The hymn floated through the open door where Owen stood, and Emily saw him close, his eyes, letting the music wash over him. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Other voices joined in, harmony rising to the rafters he'd mended that very day. When Emily glanced at Owen again, she saw something she'd never witnessed before. A full, unguarded smile transforming his weathered face. The evening ended with more songs, more shared food, more easy conversation. Emily found herself surrounded by women who wanted to discuss patterns and recipes, treating her like an old friend rather than an outsider. Even Owen received several hearty handshakes and thanks for his work on the roof. They walked back to the inn together under a sky bright with stars, their breath frosting in the cold air. "You have a gift," Owen said quietly. "Your voice, it reminds folks of better things." Emily touched his arm gently. "You have gifts too. I saw how you were with those children today." He ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. "Never thought they'd take to me like that. Always figured I scared them." "Children see truth better than most. They saw what I see. A good man who just needed a chance to show it." They reached the inn's porch, but neither moved to go inside just yet. The night was perfectly still, as if the world was holding its breath. "Feels almost like we could belong here," Owen said softly, wonderingly. "If things were different." Before Emily could respond, hoofbeats broke the quiet. A rider approached through the darkness, making straight for them. Emily felt Owen tense beside her, his brief moment of peace shattering. The messenger pulled up short, his horse's flanks steaming in the cold. "Mr. Boone?" He held out an official-looking envelope. "From the mining company's lawyers. They're demanding a new hearing. Day after tomorrow." Owen took the envelope, his hand steady though Emily could see the effort it cost him. The messenger tipped his hat and rode away, leaving them alone with this fresh challenge. Emily watched Owen's face in the lamplight from the inn's windows. The smile was gone, replaced by familiar lines of worry. But something was different now. He stood straighter, his eyes clearer. The day's simple acts of kindness and community had given him something to hold on to. "Whatever comes," she said firmly, "we face it together, with the Lord's help." Owen nodded slowly, tucking the envelope into his coat. "Together," he agreed, and in that word was a prayer of its own. They bid each other good night, each retreating to their separate rooms. But Emily lingered at her window, watching the stars wheel above the sleeping town. So much had changed in just one day. Small changes, perhaps, but like seeds planted in fertile soil, ready to grow into something stronger. She could still hear the evening's hymns echoing in her memory, still see Owen smile as he worked with the children. The mining company might have money and power, but they didn't have this web of human connections slowly being rewoven, this community learning to see with new eyes. Emily knelt beside her bed, hands folded in prayer. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight had shown her something precious, that hearts could change, that trust could be rebuilt, that even the longest winter eventually yielded to spring. Outside her window, a last patch of snow slid from a roof and landed with a soft thump, like punctuation at the end of a hopeful sentence. The courthouse sat squat and imposing in the morning light. Emily smoothed her best dress, the one she'd mended 3 times but still wore proudly. Owen stood beside her, his Sunday coat brushed clean, hair combed neat as he could manage. They climbed the wooden steps together, boots echoing in the hushed air. Inside, the hearing room smelled of pine wood and dust. Morning sun streamed through tall windows, catching motes in its beams. The mining company's lawyer, Mr. Harrison, sat at one table, papers spread before him like a general planning battle. His suit was crisp, his watch chain gold. Emily and Owen took their places at the other table. Reverend Hale sat behind them, a silent supporter. A few townspeople filtered in, settling on the wooden benches with whispered conversations. Judge Peterson entered, his black robes sweeping. Everyone rose, then settled again as he took his seat. The old man's eyes were sharp, despite his years, scanning the room with practiced authority. "Matter of water rights and land deed dispute," he announced, voice carrying. "Silverton Mining Concern versus Owen Boone. Proceed." Mr. Harrison rose smoothly, a slim folder in his manicured hands. "Your Honor, I present evidence that the land in question was legally purchased by the Silverton Mining Concern through proxy 7 years ago." He approached the bench with measured steps. "This document shows the sale, signed and witnessed." Emily felt Owen stiffen beside her. She glanced at the yellowed paper being handed to the judge, her seamstress's eye catching details. The ink too fresh, the paper too clean for its supposed age. "As you can see," Harrison continued, "the land was bought under the name James Murphy, acting as agent for the company. Mr. Boone's subsequent occupation of the property was unauthorized." Owen half rose, his chair scraping. "That's a lie. I cleared that land myself, built every—" "Mr. Boone," the judge warned, "you'll have your turn." Emily touched Owen's arm gently. He subsided, but she could feel him trembling with suppressed rage. The judge studied the document carefully, holding it to the light. Emily prayed he would see what she saw, the subtle wrongness of it. But after long minutes, he lowered the paper with a sigh. "The document appears legitimate," he said heavily, "unless you can produce proof of prior claim." Owen's voice was rough. "I filed my homestead claim. Should be in the records." "We searched thoroughly," Harrison interjected, smoothly. "No such filing was found. Perhaps misplaced." Emily knew what that meant. The mining company had seen to it that Owen's proper claim vanished, but proving that was another matter entirely. The judge cleared his throat. "Given the evidence presented, I must declare the property under dispute." He raised his gavel. "The occupants will have 1 week to vacate the premises until ownership can be definitively established." The gavel fell with a crack that seemed to echo in Emily's chest. 1 week, 7 days to leave the home Owen had built with his own hands, the land he'd tended through harsh winters and lonely years. She gripped his hand tightly, feeling the calluses earned by that labor. His fingers were cold in hers, but he returned the pressure, drawing strength from her touch. They filed out of the courthouse into bright sunshine that seemed to mock their loss. Owen walked stiffly, like a man bearing an invisible wound. Emily matched his pace, her mind already working on what they would need to pack, how to manage the livestock, where they might go. "I'm sorry," Reverend Hale said quietly, catching up to them. "I'll continue searching the records. Perhaps there's something we missed." Owen nodded curtly, but Emily saw the defeat in his shoulders. They both knew how thoroughly the mining company would have erased any trace of his rightful claim. They made their way to the general store, needing supplies for the move they'd been forced into. Emily's thoughts churned as she examined sacks of flour, trying to calculate what they could afford, what they could carry. The store was crowded with morning shoppers, their conversations a low buzz until one voice cut through sharper than the rest. "Swears he saw him in St. Joseph last month," Mrs. Kendrick, the miner's wife, was saying. "Living large as you please, gambling away other folks' money?" Emily froze, her hand on a bolt of cloth. She knew, somehow, what was coming. And here his wife's up here, fixing to marry again. Though I suppose if Thomas Penrose wants to hide from his debts in Missouri, that's one way to do it. The bolt of cloth slipped from Emily's numb fingers. The sound of it hitting the floor was lost in the sudden silence, as every eye turned to her. Shame and grief crashed over her like a wave. The secret she'd carried, the guilt she'd tried to bury, exposed in the cruelest way possible. Tears blurred her vision as she turned and fled, pushing past startled customers into the street. Behind her, she heard Owen's voice, low and dangerous. "You got a cruel tongue, Mrs. Kendrick. Best mind it." Emily ran until she couldn't anymore, finally stopping in the churchyard. She sank onto a bench, pressing her hands to her burning face. The truth she'd hidden even from herself lay exposed like a raw nerve. Thomas wasn't dead as she'd believed. He was alive, still causing harm, making her unwitting deception even worse. Heavy footsteps approached, then stopped. She didn't need to look up to know it was Owen. His shadow fell across her like protection, but she couldn't bear to see judgment in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I truly thought he was dead." 3 years with no word, his family saying he'd been killed in a riverboat accident. She drew a shuddering breath. "I should have made certain, should have waited longer, should have—" "Stop." Owen's voice was gentle, gentler than she deserved. "You ain't the first person to be fooled by a no-good man." He settled onto the bench beside her, careful to leave space between them. His big hands hung between his knees, empty of comfort he didn't know how to give. "Ain't my place to judge," he said slowly. "Lord knows I've got my own sins to answer for." Emily wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "I never meant to deceive anyone, especially not you." "I know that." They sat in heavy silence as the sun climbed higher. Around them, the first tentative signs of spring made themselves known. A robin's song, the drip of melting snow from the church eaves, a hint of green pushing through old leaves. But the promise of renewal felt hollow now. They'd lost everything in the space of a morning. Owen's land, Emily's reputation, the fragile trust they'd been building between them. The day aged into evening, and they returned separately to the inn. Emily took her meal in her room, unable to face the whispers and stares that would surely greet her in the dining room. Through the thin wall, she could hear Owen's heavy tread in the next room, pacing like a caged bear. Night fell soft and dark. Emily sat by her window, watching the last patches of snow glisten in the starlight. In the street below, water trickled steadily from the eaves, winter's grip loosening day by day. But the thaw brought no comfort now, only the knowledge that soon they would have to leave this place, carrying their separate burdens of loss and shame. She heard Owen's pacing stop. Through the wall came the creak of his bed as he sat, then silence. They were together in the building, yet far apart, each locked in private grief, unable to bridge the gap that circumstance had carved between them. Emily pressed her forehead to the cool glass, watching her breath fog the pain. Somewhere out there, Thomas lived and breathed and caused harm, while she paid the price of his deceptions. Somewhere out there, mining company men were probably already measuring Owen's land for their taking. The steady drip of melting snow marked time's passage, each drop a reminder that their week of grace was already beginning to slip away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make. But tonight, there was only silence, broken by water falling from the eaves like tears. Owen pushed through the stable doors, the hinges groaning in protest against the cold. Inside, darkness wrapped around him like a shroud. The familiar scents of hay, leather, and horse sweat couldn't calm the storm in his mind tonight. He slumped onto a hay bale, his massive frame casting a long shadow in the pale lamplight. The horses shuffled in their stalls, their breath making steam in the chilly air. His old mule nickered softly, sensing his distress. "Hush now," he muttered, but his voice cracked. Everything he touched turned to ash. The land he'd worked so hard to claim, slipping through his fingers like water. And Emily, with her quiet strength and endless faith. Emily, who carried her own wounds yet still found the courage to smile. Emily, who might be married still, though no fault of her own. The thought twisted in his gut like a knife. He'd been a fool to think he deserved peace. Cursed men didn't get second chances. The mining company would take his land, just like they'd taken everything else. The town would whisper about Emily's shame, and she'd leave like all the others. It was fitting, he reckoned. A giant of a man with a giant's curse, to walk alone, to break what he tried to protect. Hours passed. The lamp burned low, shadows deepening in the corners. Outside, the night grew old, stars wheeling across the sky. Owen sat motionless, lost in dark thoughts, while his animals slept around him. Up in their rented room, Emily knelt beside her narrow bed. Her knees ached on the rough wooden floor, but she welcomed the discomfort. It kept her focused on her prayers. "Lord," she whispered, "grant me wisdom to see your path. Grant me strength to walk it." Her fingers worried at her shawl's fringe. "And Lord, help Owen see himself as you see him, as I see him." The room grew colder as night deepened. Emily prayed until her voice grew hoarse, until her legs cramped and her back protested. She prayed for forgiveness, not just for herself, but for Thomas who had wronged her, for the town that judged so quickly, for Owen who judged himself so harshly. When the first gray light of dawn began seeping through her window, Emily rose stiffly. She knew where to find Owen. Wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders, she made her way down to the stable. He sat exactly as she'd imagined, a mountain of a man trying to make himself small, surrounded by sleeping animals and dying lamplight. His eyes, when they met hers, were hollow with exhaustion and something deeper, something like despair. "You don't scare me, Owen Boone," Emily said softly, her voice carrying in the pre-dawn quiet. "You scare yourself." Owen's shoulders hunched. He looked away, unable to hold her steady gaze. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Emily waited, patient as the mountains themselves. When he still didn't speak, she squared her shoulders. "I'm going back to the cabin." That got his attention. His head snapped up, brow furrowing. "What?" "Those company men won't wait a week. They'll burn everything we don't save." She adjusted her shawl with firm hands. "I won't let them destroy what you built, what we might build together." "Emily," his voice was rough as pine bark. "You don't understand. I'm cursed. Everything I touch is blessed," she cut in, "by the care you give it. Your land thrives, your animals trust you, and I—" She paused, gathering courage. "I trust you too." Owen stared at her, his scarred face a mask of confusion and yearning. But he couldn't find words to answer her faith. Emily turned toward the stable doors. Morning light spilled through the cracks, painting golden lines across the straw-strewn floor. "I'm leaving now. Whether you come with me or not, that's your choice to make." She stepped out into the gray dawn, her back straight despite the weight of uncertainty she carried. Owen watched her go, his heart torn between the familiar comfort of despair and the terrifying possibility of hope that Emily offered. The sun was just touching the mountain peaks, turning the lingering snow to fire. Emily's figure grew smaller as she walked toward the road that led to his cabin. Their cabin, maybe, if he could find the courage to believe in second chances. Owen remained in the stable's shadows, wrestling with his fears, watching the bravest woman he'd ever known walk away into the morning light. Emily urged the borrowed mule up the mountain trail, her bones aching from 2 days of hard riding. The cold bit through her shawl despite the sun hanging high overhead. She'd traded her last coins for supplies and feed at the general store, determined to save what she could of Owen's homestead. Their homestead, she corrected herself with a prayer. The cabin stood silent against the gathering clouds, just as they'd left it. Emily's stiff fingers fumbled with the door latch. Inside, the hearth was cold as stone. She moved with purpose, dropping her saddlebags and kneeling to build a fire. The kindling caught quickly, hungry for flame. After tending to the mule and checking the livestock in their snow-dusted pens, Emily returned to the cabin's warmth. Her practical mind turned to the task ahead. She'd need to sort Owen's belongings, decide what to save before the mining company men arrived. His heavy coat hung by the door, still bearing the shape of his broad shoulders. Emily lifted it, feeling its familiar weight. As she folded the worn wool, her fingers brushed something in the pocket, a small leather pouch she'd never noticed before. Inside, she found a piece of paper, yellowed with age and creased from being folded many times. Emily's hands trembled as she carefully opened it. Her eyes widened at the territorial governor's seal, still visible despite the faded ink. Below it, clear as daylight, was a land grant with Owen's name and the proper boundaries of his claim. "Oh, Lord," she whispered, sinking into Owen's chair by the hearth. This document could save everything: the land, the water rights, their future. The fire crackled softly as exhaustion crept over her. Emily clutched the precious paper to her chest, her prayers of thanksgiving trailing into sleep as fresh snow began falling outside the cabin windows. The first rays of dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in rose gold as Emily mounted the borrowed mule. She'd tucked the precious land grant close to her heart, safely pinned inside her dress. The document's weight reminded her of everything at stake: Owen's land, their future, the chance for redemption. The trail down was treacherous, slick with fresh ice under yesterday's snowfall. Halfway down the mountain, the mule's hooves slipped on a frozen patch. Emily's heart jumped to her throat as the animal struggled for footing. "Easy now," she whispered, stroking its neck. "Lord, guide our steps." Her quiet prayers steadied them both as they picked their way carefully forward. In Silverton, Emily didn't pause to brush the snow from her skirts. She burst through Reverend Hale's office door, her cheeks bright red from cold and exertion, breathing hard from the journey. "Look what I found," she gasped, carefully extracting the document. The preacher's eyes widened as he examined the territorial governor's seal. "This is genuine," he said, reaching for his notary supplies. "Let me write a proper statement to support it." Meanwhile, Owen paced the boarding house floor, sick with worry. Word had spread that Emily was missing in the mountains. His mind tortured him with visions of her lying hurt in the snow, all because of his stubborn pride. The door burst open. There stood Emily, covered in snow but glowing with triumph. Owen crossed the room in 3 long strides, his arms wrapped around her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he wept silently against her shoulder. They held each other before the crackling hearth, the precious document safe between them, while relief and something deeper, love born of shared trials, filled the quiet room. The mountain air crackled with tension as hoofbeats echoed up the trail. Emily stood at the cabin window, counting 12 riders approaching through the morning mist, their rifles gleaming. Owen's hand found hers, warm and steady. "Stay behind me," he whispered, but Emily shook her head. "We face this together. she said softly. They stepped out onto the cabin's porch. The spring snow was melting, creating tiny rivulets that sang down the rocky slope. Owen held the land grant high, its parchment catching the sunlight. The miners reined their horses to a halt, their faces hard beneath dust-covered hats. The foreman's hand rested on his rifle. "Clear out, Boone. This ain't your land no more." Owen's voice carried across the yard, clear and strong as he'd never spoken before. He read the grant aloud, each word ringing with authority. The governor's seal caught the light, unmistakable and true. The foreman's face twisted. "That paper could be forged." "You know it ain't," Owen replied calmly. Emily's presence beside him steadied his heart. "But I'm offering you a choice. Take your water share, but build a school. One that welcomes every child, miners' kids and Ute children alike. That's my price for peace." The men shifted in their saddles, exchanging uncertain glances. Shame crept across their features as they remembered their own children, playing in muddy streets while the company's profits flowed away downstream. "A school?" the foreman asked, his voice softer now. "For all our children," Owen nodded. "Better than fighting, ain't it?" One by one the rifles lowered. The foreman dismounted, extending his hand. "Reckon you're right, Boone." As they shook hands, spring water trickled down the mountainside, blessing the earth with promise of new growth. Spring painted the mountainside in wild colors as workers raised the schoolhouse by the creek. The sound of hammers and saws filled the clear morning air, while children gathered wildflowers along the bank. Both miners and Ute families brought food to share, their laughter mingling with the sound of rushing water. On the wedding day, sunshine streamed through the new rafters, casting golden light across rough-hewn benches. Emily wore a dove-gray dress she'd sewn herself, trimmed with lace saved from her mother's wedding gown. Owen stood tall in a pressed black coat, his beard neatly trimmed, his eyes bright with wonder. Reverend Hale's voice carried through the schoolhouse as he read from 1 Corinthians. "Love is patient, love is kind." Owen's large hands trembled as he slipped the simple gold band onto Emily's finger. Tears gleamed in his eyes, but his voice rang strong and clear. "I do." Emily's hymn rose sweet and pure, filling every corner of the wooden room. The miners removed their hats and bowed their heads, while Ute mothers rocked their babies in time to the melody. Outside, children scattered flower petals in the spring breeze, their giggles mixing with bird song. Together, Owen and Emily climbed to the bell tower. Their hands joined on the rope, pulling in unison. The clear tone echoed through the valley, announcing their joy to the mountains. That evening, they returned to their cabin, now transformed by Emily's loving touch. Lamplight glowed on fresh curtains and swept floors. They shared their first supper as husband and wife by the hearth. Fresh bread, mountain trout, and wild honey. In the flickering firelight, Owen reached across the table to take Emily's hand, their matching rings catching the warm light. Months swept past like wind through mountain grass. Summer painted the valley in rich emerald hues, warming the creek banks where wildflowers nodded in the breeze. The schoolhouse bustled with life and learning, its windows thrown open to catch the fresh air. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Owen stood among shavings and sawdust, his patience matching his strength as he guided young boys' hands on planes and saws. "Steady now," he'd say, his voice gentle as he showed them how to read the grain of wood. "Let the tool do the work." The boys watched in wonder as their clumsy attempts slowly transformed into smooth boards and simple boxes they could proudly carry home. In the classroom next door, Emily's needle flashed in the sunlight as she demonstrated careful stitches to a circle of attentive girls. Her lessons wove scripture with practical skills, her calm voice reading passages while fingers worked thread and fabric. "Like these stitches hold cloth together," she'd explain. "Faith holds our community as one." The girls nodded, their faces serious as they practiced their neat rows. Sunday mornings found Owen and Emily in their wagon, wheels creaking along the mountain trail to the chapel in the valley. The same hands that had built it now passed hymnals to neighbors, while Emily's voice led the singing. Gone were the suspicious glances and whispered mockery. Now townspeople and miners alike greeted them with warm smiles and firm handshakes. One evening, as the sun sank behind the peaks, Emily stood on their cabin porch. Golden light caught in her hair as she hummed her favorite hymn, the one she'd sung at their wedding. The melody drifted over the homestead, where their garden flourished and chickens scratched in the yard. Owen stepped out behind her, his heavy boots quiet on the wooden boards. His arm slipped around her waist, strong and sure, drawing her close against his side. The setting sun painted everything in honey light, the split-rail fence he'd mended, the new barn roof, the path to the creek where children played during afternoon lessons. "You lasted more than a week, Em," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You gave me a life." His words held all the weight of their shared struggles, their victories, their daily chosen love. Emily's laugh came soft and warm as summer rain. She leaned into his embrace, her hand finding his where it rested at her waist. Below them, the creek caught the last rays of sunlight, shimmering like a silver thread through their land. Peace settled over the homestead like a blessing, in the gentle evening breeze, in the distant song of a thrush, in the comfortable silence between two hearts that had found their home. The valley stretched before them, transformed not just by summer's touch, but by the change they'd brought to these hills. Where once stood only Owen's isolation, now grew a community. Where bitterness had rooted, now flourished forgiveness and hope. The mountain that had known such loneliness now cradled their joy, as natural as the sunset painting the peaks in gold. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.